March 12, 1945, New Orleans, Louisiana. A grey troopship bumps against the pier as hot, wet air rushes in, smelling of diesel, river mud, and salt. Behind steel doors, 200 German women brace for the horror they were promised in Nazi films: chains, beatings, black savages in American uniforms. But when the hatch swings open, they don't see monsters. They see black US soldiers standing in perfect lines, uniforms sharp, faces calm in the blinding sun. Then an old woman slips on the gangway, and the enemy, they fear, reaches out, not to hit her, but to gently hold her up. In that one small touch, years of Nazi lies begin to crack, and nothing these women believe about race, enemies, or themselves will ever be simple again. Stay with me to see how this moment in a Louisiana camp helped break Nazi ideas. And if you want more true, hidden World War II stories, please like this video, subscribe, and watch until the end. February 1945. Near Cherbourg, on France's battered northern coast, low clouds press down on a landscape churned by tanks and artillery. In a makeshift transit camp, nothing more than barbed wire, canvas tents, and the sour smell of damp straw, roughly 200 German women stood in line, clutching satchels that held almost nothing. Most wore field grey skirts or nurses' smocks under greatcoats rubbed shiny at the elbows. Their jobs had been ordinary: telephonists, secretaries, teachers drafted into the Wehrmacht's auxiliary services, Red Cross nurses like 32-year-old Greta Hoffmann, who had bandaged men from Poland to Normandy. The war had swept them forward for years. Now the Allied advance had snapped shut behind them like a steel trap. They had seen posters and newsreels warning what capture meant. American soldiers, they had been told, were barely controlled beasts, especially the black ones in US uniform. Nazi propaganda reels gave them numbers to fear. Over 500,000 Negroes in Roosevelt's army, announcers intoned, loosed upon Europe like wild animals. Pamphlets passed through field hospitals, showed lurid drawings, dark hands grabbing pale women, jagged captions about rape and murder. Better a bullet in the head than fall into their hands, one ward sister had told Greta in 1944. At the time, no one had argued. Now, in the muddy holding camp, those words hung in the air as Allied MPs, white Americans in heavy wool, British sergeants with clipped voices, moved down the line. Identification cards were checked, bags searched, jewelry and watches were tagged, registered, and locked away. There was efficiency here, but no gloating, no blows. A corporal with a Red Cross patch examined Greta's papers, pausing at the small red cross on her sleeve. "Nurse?" he asked in halting German. She nodded, heart hammering. "You are prisoner of war. Geneva, understand?" He tapped a pocket copy of the convention, then pointed toward a tent where women emerged dusted in white from delousing powder. They were issued coarse grey dresses stenciled with large black letters. PW. The letters felt like a sentence, Greta would later write in her diary. Not just prisoner of war, but a brand burned into the cloth. I thought, now they will do to us what we have done to others. Paradox lived in that line. The women feared the enemy's cruelty more than they feared their own regime's camps, though by early 1945, rumours of transports and disappearances had become impossible to ignore. By that winter, more than 370,000 German prisoners had already been shipped to the United States, spread across over 400 main camps and hundreds of smaller branch sites, from Texas cotton fields to Midwestern sawmills. The women in Cherbourg did not know these numbers. What they knew was a single destination: America. The order came at dusk. A column of prisoners marched past shattered houses toward the railhead, boots slipping on cinders. The smell of coal smoke and cold iron wrapped around them as they climbed into windowless boxcars. 40 to a car, sliding doors slammed, the clang echoing down the line. Someone began to sob quietly in the dark. On the second night, when the train halted at an unknown siding, Greta managed to write by the thin light that leaked through a knothole. "They say we crossed the ocean," she scrawled, hands shaking with the movement of the car. "What waits there, I cannot imagine." In the ward, we saw films of American Negro soldiers in Africa, laughing as they held German women. The officer said, "This is what defeat means. I am more afraid of these men I have never seen than of the bombs that fell on Hamburg." The fear was real, but the images in her mind were not. This wasn't propaganda, it was the aftertaste of propaganda, carried into the darkness of a cattle car. Days later, the train emptied them onto a French quay where a grey troop ship loomed, 7,000 tons of steel smelling of oil and rust. They shuffled up the gangway under the gaze of guards, not knowing that the Atlantic crossing would be only the prelude to the moment that truly mattered, not when they heard about black American soldiers, but when they finally stood face to face with them in the Louisiana sun. The Atlantic crossing was not the nightmare they had imagined. It was something stranger, monotony laced with dread. They were herded into a converted hold, hammocks slung 3 tiers high, the air thick with the smells of oil, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of seawater seeping into rust. The ship was built to carry nearly 1,500 men, but this transport held barely a few hundred prisoners and a skeleton crew. Space was still tight. At night, the groan of steel plates and the relentless thud of engines made sleep a shallow, exhausted thing. Many women grew seasick within hours of leaving Cherbourg. Buckets were set out along the bulkheads. By the second day, the sour smell of vomit battled with the disinfectant the American medics sprinkled with military rigor. A guard, white, Midwestern accent, bored eyes, told one of them in broken German that the crossing would take 10, maybe 12 days if the weather holds. Greta used those days to write, hiding her notebook inside the lining of her issued dress. On March 10th, she scribbled, "We still have not seen the Negro soldiers the films showed us. Only white guards with freckled faces. Perhaps they are waiting for us in America. I try not to imagine." March 12th, 1945. Dawn came with a change in motion. The vibration of the engines eased. The ship slowed, then began to pivot. On deck, the air shifted from cold, salt-laden chill to something heavier, warmer, carrying the faint smell of mud and vegetation. When the hatch finally clanged open, the first thing they felt was the heat. It was not the dry warmth of a German summer, but a wet, enveloping wall. Humidity wrapped around them, slicking skin under coarse fabric, fogging the air with a faint haze that made the world too bright. The gangway rattled as they shuffled down in single file, their wooden soles knocking a hollow rhythm. New Orleans lay before them, cranes like steel skeletons, warehouses streaked with rust, the wide brown river gleaming under a white sun. The pier was a forest of vertical lines, bollards, pilings, and, most startling of all, soldiers. They stopped. Lined up in neat ranks were perhaps 30 men in U.S. Army khaki, leggings laced tight, rifles at rest. Their faces were dark, not just tanned, but black, in every shade from deep mahogany to warm bronze. Their uniforms were pressed, despite the heat, brass polished, creases sharp as knife edges. For years, the women had seen only one image of such men, leering caricatures on posters, beasts in propaganda films, used as proof that America had no racial order, no civilization. Nazi speakers quoted inflated figures, hundreds of thousands of Negroes in uniform, turned loose in Europe, as if numbers alone were a threat. In truth, by 1945, more than 1.2 million African Americans wore U.S. uniforms worldwide, though most were relegated to support and labor units. On the New Orleans dock, these particular men did nothing monstrous. They stood at attention, eyes forward, sweat beading on their temples under steel helmets. I felt my legs weaken. One former telephone operator, Liesl Hartmann, recalled decades later. We had been prepared for wild animals. What I saw was soldiers more disciplined than many of our own. An elderly woman near the front missed a step on the gangway. Her ankle twisted. She pitched sideways with a small cry. Before any German could reach her, one of the black GIs broke from the line. In 3 strides he was there, rifle still slung, one broad hand catching her elbow, the other steadying the small of her back. "You're all right, Ma'am," he said. In English she didn't understand, but his tone was unmistakably gentle. He set her upright, checked that she could stand, then returned to his place. Greta watched, stunned. "I thought they would howl like animals," she wrote that night. "Instead they were like statues in the heat, and one of them touched Frau Keller as if she were porcelain. This was not propaganda, it was reality, and it was wrong according to everything we had been taught." As they were counted and sorted, a different contradiction flickered at the edge of their perception. Beyond the fence, along the street that paralleled the docks, wooden signs hung over doors and water fountains, white and coloured in block letters. The same army that gave rifles and authority to black men still marked them as separate in its own cities. The women did not yet grasp the full meaning of those boards. All they understood was that the savages in their nightmares had become the calm hands guiding them toward waiting trucks, engines idling, canvas flaps snapping in the damp breeze. What they would see once those trucks pulled away from the river would deepen the dissonance between pre-war myth and American reality. The trucks rolled away from the docks, engines growling against the weight of heat and human cargo. Canvas flaps snapped open on the sides, letting in bands of light and air that smelled of river mud and something sweet and rotten, magnolia and decay. New Orleans fell behind, replaced by a flat, shimmering landscape. The road cut through fields and swamps where water gathered in shallow pools, reflecting the hard white sky. Cypress trees rose out of the muck, their roots like twisted fingers, draped in grey Spanish moss that swung like curtains in a theatre set for ghosts. "Is this America?" whispered 19-year-old Lisa Miller, a former telephone operator from Munich. "It looks like another planet." The black soldiers driving said little, but their silence was not hostile. When one woman sagged in the heat, eyes rolling back from dehydration, the truck lurched to a stop under a stand of pines. A canteen was passed back, cool metal sweating in the humid air. The driver watched until the woman's colour returned, then ground the gears and eased back onto the road. It was a small kindness, but in a mind trained to expect brutality, it appeared as a kind of treason against the stories they had carried across the Atlantic. After perhaps 2 hours, the convoy turned off onto a gravel lane. Ahead, beyond a double run of barbed wire, rows of white wooden barracks stretched across cleared ground. Guard towers punctuated the perimeter, but the men inside, black GIs in rolled-up sleeves, were leaning on railings, smoking, one of them reading a newspaper. No barking dogs, no searchlights sweeping in aggressive arcs. The camp looked at first glance more like a mid-sized factory town than a prison. Across the United States, there were by then over 500 major POW camps and more than 700 smaller branch facilities housing roughly 495,000 Axis prisoners by war's end. Many were built on this template: standardized barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, even chapels and theaters. But this one on Louisiana Pineland contained an additional shock. On the steps of the headquarters building stood its commander, a black officer in captain's bars, cap tilted just so, uniform immaculate despite dark sweat patches spreading under his arms. He waited until the truck shuddered to a stop and the women were formed into loose ranks. "My name is Captain Robert Hayes," he said in English, his voice carrying across the yard. A white interpreter in a side cap repeated the words in German. "You are prisoners of war of the United States Army. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work. You will be paid. You will be fed. You will not be harmed, so long as you obey camp rules." The interpreter's German was crisp. Fed, paid, not harmed. "Impossible," muttered an older woman near Greta. "A Negro commanding white prisoners? They make jokes with us." Yet there he stood, the living embodiment of a reversal Nazi ideology had called unthinkable. This wasn't propaganda, it was reality. They were marched to assigned barracks. Inside, the air still held the raw smell of fresh lumber and soap. Wooden bunks were stacked 2 high, each with a thin mattress, 2 grey blankets and a pillow. Wire mesh screens covered the windows to keep out insects. Ceiling fans turned slowly, stirring the heavy air just enough to feel like a promise. In the corner, bolted to a shelf, sat a radio, its dial glowing amber as a swing tune crackled through the speakers. Brass, drums, a saxophone, laughing. Degenerate music, someone whispered automatically, echoing party lectures, but the melody was bright, intricate, controlled. Greta felt the first flicker of doubt about that word. The real shock came an hour later in the long, screened-in mess hall. They queued with tin trays expecting the thin soup and dark, sawdust-laden bread that had become Europe's wartime standard. In 1945, the average German civilian survived on barely 200 to 1,500 calories a day. In bombed-out cities, it was often less. US Army regulations, by contrast, allotted POWs rations equivalent to American troops, often over 3,000 calories daily, a fact that would later spark resentment back in Europe. As the line moved, the smells hit them first. Coffee, real coffee, with the bitter, roasted edge they hadn't encountered in years. Bacon spitting fat onto a hot griddle. Scrambled eggs piled in yellow hills. A black mess orderly in a stained apron scooped eggs onto Greta's plate, added 2 strips of bacon, a wedge of white bread glistening with butter. He jerked his chin toward the end of the line, where a GI poured dark coffee into tin cups and, astonishingly, a white porcelain jug of cream waited. I stared at the food as if it were a trick, Greta recalled. I thought now they will laugh and take it away, or they will punish us if we eat. But nothing happened, only the smell of bacon and my own hunger. Most of the women hesitated, hands hovering. The orderly caught their confusion. He lifted an invisible fork to his mouth in a pantomime of eating, gave a small, lopsided smile, then turned to the next tray. The spell broke. Someone took a bite. Another followed. In moments, the hall was filled with the clink of cutlery and the soft, urgent sounds of chewing. Some women ate too fast and grew sick, pushing away plates with trembling hands. Others savored each mouthful, eyes closed. In Hamburg they were boiling grass, read one later letter from home. Here, behind wire, captives ate better than their starving families. The taste of salty bacon and hot coffee contrasted so violently with what they had expected that it left them dizzy. And yet, the day still had more contradictions to offer, especially when they learned what was expected of them in return for those meals. The bell clanged in the dark, a dull, insistent ringing that cut through sleep and dreams. Reveille came at 5 a.m. The air outside was cool for a few minutes, a thin grey mist hanging low between the pines before the sun dragged the temperature up. The women filed into the yard, dresses already damp at the collar, breath clouding faintly as blackguards in khaki moved along the rows, counting in English and German. Eins, zwei, drei, a sergeant echoed under his breath, checking the interpreter's tally. On average, one guard watched over 20 to 30 prisoners, more a supervisor than a jailer. It was a ratio born of confidence that these particular captives would not risk escape into a land whose language, laws and distances they did not know. After roll call came work assignments. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be required to labor, but not on tasks directly tied to combat. US regulations set an 8-hour workday, with at least 1 hour's rest and guaranteed access to potable water in hot climates. In practice, the women found themselves sorted by previous skills: nurses to the camp infirmary, clerks to the administrative offices, others to the laundry, kitchens, or maintenance crews mending fences and hauling supplies. Greta was sent to the infirmary, a low white building that smelled of carbolic acid and talcum powder. There she changed dressings on other prisoners' blisters and tended the occasional fever under the direction of an American doctor who seemed more interested in her technique than her nationality. Those assigned to the laundry labored over great boilers where steam curled up in wet clouds, soaking hair and fabric. The slap of wet cloth on tables, the hiss of irons, the tang of soap, these sounds and smells filled their days instead of the whine of sirens and the crash of falling bombs. For 8 hours we worked, then we stopped, remembered Lisa Miller. There was water whenever we asked, breaks in the shade. I kept waiting for the moment when the mask would slip and the cruelty would begin. It never came. For their labor, each woman earned a small wage, 80 cents a day in camp scrip according to U.S. Army policy. The paper coupons, printed with eagles and official seals, could be spent at the camp canteen on soap, stationery, or occasionally luxuries like chocolate or cigarettes. The irony was not lost on them. In Germany, money had lost its meaning in the face of scarcity. Here, prisoners used American currency substitutes to buy American goods under the watch of American guards they had been trained to fear. In the off hours, they watched those guards as if studying a foreign species. In the late afternoon, when the worst heat bled out of the day, the central yard transformed. Black soldiers in undershirts and rolled trousers marked out a diamond with battered canvas bags. Someone produced a scuffed baseball and a gleaming wooden bat. A game began. The crack of wood on leather echoed off the barracks. Shouts of "Safe!" and "You're out!" carried on the thick air. Laughter burst like sudden rain. From behind the wire, German women leaned against fence posts, eyes following the arc of the ball as it sailed into a sky, turning slowly from white to gold. It was the first time I saw them as normal, one former stenographer, Helga Klein, would say. They argued about rules, they teased each other. It did not fit with the idea of savages we had been fed. On a bench under a pine, one GI whittled. During innings he sat out, curls of pale wood falling at his feet. Over days the scraps became shapes, a horse with arched neck, a dog mid-stride, a small bird with outstretched wings. One evening he hesitated by the fence, then shyly pushed the bird through an opening to a little girl visiting her prisoner mother. The child's eyes widened. She clutched the toy with both hands. These were the hands we had been told would destroy us, Greta wrote. Instead, they made toys. It was during one of those soft evenings that she first spoke properly with Sergeant James Wilson. She was sitting on a stump near the infirmary, diary open on her knees, when a shadow fell across the page. She looked up to see a tall man in khaki, skin the colour of dark tobacco leaves, a faint limp in his right leg. "You writing down all our atrocities?" he asked in English, a wry twist at the corner of his mouth. Her English was limited, but tone bridged much of the gap. "No atrocities," she said carefully. "That is the problem." He chuckled, then sat on the low step nearby, keeping a respectful distance, the resinous smell of pine mixed with the faint tobacco from his pocket. "Name's Wilson, Sergeant, Georgia." She hesitated, then offered, "Greta." "Nurse." Over the next days and weeks, fragments of conversation, half in English, half in her halting attempts, helped by gestures, and the occasional interpreter, built a picture that did not match any lecture she had heard in Germany. Wilson had fought in North Africa and Italy. A shell fragment in the Apennines had carved the limp into his leg. Guard duty here was part of his recovery. "You fought for freedom," she said one evening, sounding out the word. "Something like that," he answered. "Fought for a country where my mama still has to sit in the back of the bus. Can't vote. Can't live where she wants." The idea snagged in her mind, a riddle with no answer. Here was a man trusted with a rifle and rank, placed in command over white prisoners from a regime that would have murdered him on sight, yet denied basic rights in his own homeland. "This is upside down," she confided later to her notebook. "We, who believed ourselves the master race, are prisoners, eating well and being treated correctly. He, whom our laws would have called Untermensch, has stripes on his arm but no vote in his own town. This is not the world the party described. This is not propaganda. It is reality, and I do not know where to put it in my head." The daily rhythm, roll calls, work, baseball games, quiet talks under the pines, was slowly reshaping them. But routine alone could be rationalized away. It was when news from the outside began seeping through the cracks of the camp, through newspapers, through Red Cross bulletins, through letters from home, that the scaffolding of their old beliefs truly began to collapse. In late May, a Red Cross truck rattled through the gate, dust pluming behind it on the dry road. By then, the women had settled into a rhythm. Weeks slipped by, measured in laundry loads, clinic visits, and the changing taste of the mess hall soup. Then a notice went up on the bulletin board outside headquarters. Mail service to and from Germany was being established. Each prisoner would be allowed to send and receive a limited number of letters, at first 1 or 2 a month, no more than 24 lines each, subject to censorship. It was a system already in place for the hundreds of thousands of German POWs scattered across America's interior. Now, belatedly, it reached this Louisiana camp. "You may write home," the interpreter announced. "You may tell your families you are alive. You may ask questions about their health, their homes. No politics." Ink and paper sold out at the canteen within hours. That evening, under bare bulbs and the whir of ceiling fans, women bent over tables, the scratch of their borrowed pens weaving a new sound into the barracks' nightly chorus. "Dear Mother, I am in America as a prisoner," Greta wrote on her first form. "We are treated correctly and have enough to eat. Do not worry for me. Tell me everything about you and our house. Are you safe?" It took 6 weeks for the first replies to cross the Atlantic, pass through censors' hands, and finally arrive as a bundle of envelopes bound with twine. Names were called in the yard. Hands trembled as thin rectangles of home were pressed into them. The letters smelled faintly of damp and coal smoke, as if they had soaked up the air of ruined cities. Greta's was from her younger sister in Hamburg. "Our street is gone," the familiar hand reported in tight script. "Of 40 houses, 6 are standing. We live in a cellar with 3 other families. Food is almost nothing. They say the ration is 1,000 calories, but I think they lie. We queue for hours for a few potatoes and black bread that is half sawdust. Last week, I boiled dandelions. Once, I ate grass. Please do not be angry. Sometimes I go with a British soldier for a tin of beans. Children on the corner died of dysentery. You are lucky to be in America. At least the Americans are human." The words blurred as Greta's eyes filled. Bacon and eggs from the mess hall turned to ash in her memory. Around her, similar scenes unfolded. Women slumped onto bunks, letters clutched, as stories of Dresden, Cologne, Königsberg poured into the camp. Streets flattened, families scattered, millions of refugees streaming west ahead of the Red Army. By 1945, nearly 14 million Germans had fled or been expelled from Eastern Europe. Their suffering did not erase what the Reich had done, but it added a new, dark layer to the picture. Parallel to the personal letters, another kind of paper began to circulate. At the small camp library, 3 rooms lined with shelves that smelled of dust, and binding glue, newspapers and magazines arrived in bundles, Stars and Stripes, the New York Times, Life, German-language leaflets produced by Allied psychological warfare units. There were also copies of Der Ruf, a newspaper written by German POWs in the US under American oversight, filled with essays about democracy, denazification, and reconstruction. At first, many women avoided the images laid out on the reading tables, grainy photos from newly liberated camps. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen showed heaps of emaciated bodies, faces like skulls, survivors staring past the camera with hollow eyes. "They are for effect," muttered Frau Kessler, an unrepentant party member. "The Americans make these things up. Remember what they say about us." But the pictures kept coming. Different angles, different camps, different photographers. British film reels of Bergen-Belsen showed bulldozers pushing corpses into mass graves because there were too many to bury by hand. American reports spoke of 10,000 dead on liberation, 40,000 more near death. Greta sat with one spread before her, fingers pressed so hard to the table's edge that her knuckles whitened. "I stared until my eyes hurt," she later wrote. "At first I thought, it is enemy propaganda. Then I thought, if even half is true, it is unbearable. Finally, I saw the striped uniforms and I remembered the trains we pretended not to notice. We didn't know, we always said. In that room, I understood how much we had chosen not to know. We didn't know became a refrain in the barracks, spoken half in defense, half in despair. But as more details emerged, testimonies of gas chambers at Auschwitz, numbers like 6 million Jews murdered, hundreds of thousands of Roma, disabled, political prisoners, the phrase began to taste like ash. The blackguards did not lecture them about these things. Wilson and his men continued their rounds, their ball games, their quiet conversations. It wasn't my place to tell them their own history, he would say years later. The newspapers were doing that. We just tried to act right. That contrast, the horror unfolding on paper, and the daily, unremarkable decency of the very men their ideology had marked for elimination, forced a reckoning no official re-education film could match. The weight of it settled over the camp like the summer humidity, heavy, pressing, impossible to escape. And then, as June bled into July and thunderheads began to pile on the horizon, the Louisiana sky itself would join the lesson, with storms and music that pushed the women's shaken certainties into something closer to transformation. One July evening, as the women queued for roll call, the western sky went from hazy blue to a bruised purple. Thick, anvil-shaped clouds stacked on one another like advancing columns. The air that had been merely hot all day turned electric, heavy, breathless, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. "It smells like the seconds before the bombs fell," one woman murmured, and several others nodded without realizing they had. The first thunderclap cracked directly overhead. It was not the distant rumble of summer rain, but a flat, concussive report that made the barracks windows rattle. For a moment, time folded. They were back in Hamburg, in Munich, in Essen, crouched in shelters, while the sky tore itself apart. Rain followed as if some vast cistern had overturned. In seconds, the packed dirt between the buildings became a slick of mud. Water hammered the tin roofs so hard that people had to shout to be heard. Lightning strobed white through the cracks in the shutters, turning the world into a sequence of frozen, high-contrast photographs. Inside one barracks, a leak opened along a seam, a thin stream at first, then a steady pour that soaked mattresses and blankets in a widening circle. Women huddled away from it, flinching with each thunderclap. Someone whimpered in the dark. The door banged open. Silhouetted against the blaze of lightning stood Sergeant Wilson, rainwater running off his cap in rivulets. Behind him, 2 other blackguards carried armfuls of spare blankets, steam rising from their wet uniforms in the warmer air. "We're moving you," Wilson called over the noise, his English words carried in German by the interpreter at his side. "Next barracks is dry. Bring what you can." They went row by row, steadying hands, lifting small suitcases, guiding the older women who shook too badly to walk alone. Outside, the mud sucked at boots, rain stung faces like thrown gravel. In the mess hall, someone had set up urns of coffee, and the rich, bitter smell cut through the damp odor of wet wood and fear. Greta found herself rooted halfway down the aisle, back pressed to the wall, fingers digging into the rough boards. "Reminds you of home?" Wilson asked, pausing near her, voice softer now that they were indoors. She managed a nod. "Bombs," she said, the English word coming out clipped. He hesitated, then sat on the bench opposite, leaving space as always, his wet jacket dripping onto the planks. For a moment, they just listened, to the drumming on the roof, to the occasional crack of thunder that made both of them flinch, though for different reasons. "Why do you care if we are dry?" she blurted suddenly. "If we sleep in the water? We are your enemies. We believed," she groped for words, "terrible things about you, about all of you." Wilson looked down at his hands, big and calloused, a white scar tracing one knuckle. When he spoke, his words were slow, deliberate. The interpreter struggling to keep up. "I seen what happens when folks get treated like animals," he said. "In Italy, in North Africa, in stories from back home. Somebody's got to say it stops here. He lifted his eyes to hers. If we treat you the way your people treated others, what does that make us? Just the next link in the same ugly chain. Greta stared, the storm's roar fading to a dull backdrop as the idea sank in. But after what my country did, you have every reason to hate us, she whispered. Sure, he said. Hate's easy. Blame is easy. You don't have to think when you hate. But maybe it's time somebody tried the harder thing. That night in her diary she wrote, he spoke of breaking a chain I had not even seen before. All my life I believed strength meant hardness. Here is a man strong enough to be gentle to those he should despise. This is not propaganda, it is reality, and it leaves me without excuses. A few weeks later, on a Saturday, when the air had finally cooled after days of storms, Louisiana can see thunder on more than 60 days a year, they would later learn, the camp assembled for something different. Word had spread that the black soldiers were putting on a concert. They came to the square in their work dresses, uncertain. Benches had been dragged from the mess hall. A makeshift stage of pallets and planks stood under a canopy of string lights. On it, a small group of GIs tuned instruments, a trumpet, a saxophone, a clarinet, a battered upright piano hauled from the recreation hut, and a drum kit whose skins gleamed in the last of the daylight. Across the U.S. Army, more than 200 official bands had formed during the war, many of them playing the swing and jazz that had become America's dominant popular sound. Here, on this humid patch of prison ground, one such unit went to war not with rifles, but with rhythm. Captain Hayes stepped forward, speaking briefly through the interpreter. "These men are our band," he said. "You are invited to listen, that is all." The first tune exploded into the air with a bright trumpet line, drums snapping underneath, the saxophone wove in, all warm and reedy, notes tumbling over one another in playful argument. Feet that had marched in goose step now tapped uncertainly against the dirt. Then the tempo slowed. The pianist's fingers found a blues progression, aching, patient. The saxophonist closed his eyes, drawing out a single note until it quivered, then slid into a melody that seemed to hold sorrow and hope in the same breath. In Germany, they called this Neger music, jungle noise, Lisa remembered. That night it was the most civilized thing I had ever heard. Sweat shone on the musicians' faces. One of them, the sax player, rocked slightly with the phrasing, as if he were praying. In the second row of benches, a woman who had lost 2 brothers at Stalingrad began to cry, soundless tears tracking through dust. "I had been told that these people could not create culture," Greta wrote afterward. Yet here was music more complex than any marching song, more beautiful than what we heard in party halls. What else had they lied about? Applause started hesitantly, then grew. The band members nodded, some grinning, some simply ducking their heads. In the weeks that followed, the memory of that storm and that concert fused in many minds. Fear answered not with domination but with blankets and hot coffee. Degenerate music revealed as disciplined art. Together they deepened the question Wilson had posed under the thunder. If cruelty was easy, what did it look like to choose the hard road instead? It was a question that would press on them even more urgently as news filtered into the camp that the war was ending, not just in Europe, but everywhere, and the gates that had become a strange kind of safety would soon open the other way. The news arrived not in a shout, but in a series of crackling bulletins over the camp radio. August 6th, 1945. The announcer's English poured through the speakers in the recreation hut, followed by the interpreter's halting German. An American bomber had dropped a single weapon on a Japanese city called Hiroshima. One bomb, they said, had destroyed 4 square miles, killing tens of thousands in seconds. 3 days later came Nagasaki. By August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice, thin and distant, carried across half a world, told his people to lay down their arms. "The war is over," the interpreter summarized, switching off the set. Everywhere, for the Americans, victory meant parades, headlines 3 inches tall, plans to go home. For the German women behind the pine trees and barbed wire, it meant something less jubilant and more uncertain. Freedom was suddenly not an abstract concept, but a logistical question. Where would they go, when, and to what? I thought, if the war is finished, our usefulness as prisoners is finished too, Lisa later recalled. That should have made me happy. Instead, I felt sick. We had beds, food. In my sister's letters, children died in the streets. Which was better, this cage or that freedom? By then, the paradox was stark. US regulations still put POW rations close to those of US soldiers, often 3,000 calories or more, while occupied Germany struggled to feed civilians on less than half that. At the same time, Washington and London were debating what to do with roughly 3.7 million German POWs held across all theatres, including about 370,000 in the United States alone. They would not keep them forever. One stifling afternoon in late August, a notice went up. All prisoners were to assemble in the central yard at 1400 hours. The sun hammered straight down. Dust puffed underfoot. Cicadas shrilled in the trees with mechanical insistence. The women formed uneven ranks, shielding their eyes. On the raised platform stood Captain Hayes in full dress uniform, cap on, brass gleaming. Beside him waited the familiar white interpreter, clipboard in hand. "The global war has ended," Hayes began, the interpreter shadowing his words in German. "Germany has surrendered. Japan has surrendered. The guns are silent." A murmur ran through the rows, quickly stilled. "In the coming months," he continued, "you will be sent home. Not all at once. The ships are few, the needs are many. But you will go back to your country." The words hit with a force that was not wholly joyful. Back to bomb craters, burned neighborhoods, empty cupboards. Hayes paused, scanning the faces before him, young and old, hopeful and afraid. Sweat trickled down his temple. He ignored it. "When you return," he said, his voice hardening slightly, "people will ask you how you were treated. Some will expect horror stories. They will want to hear that Americans starved you, beat you. Some will say that black soldiers are animals, as your propaganda claimed." A bitter little laugh rippled, quickly swallowed. "I cannot control what they expect," Hayes went on, "but I am asking you to tell them the truth. Tell them that black Americans guarded you, that we carried rifles and keys, that we could have mistreated you and did not. Tell them you were fed, that you worked and were paid, that you were not shot in ditches, not gassed, not pushed into ovens." The interpreter hesitated slightly over the last word, "Ufen," but it landed. "You know now what your government did in those camps," Hayes said, glancing toward the library, as if the photographs inside were looking back. "Millions murdered because someone decided they were less than human. Jews, Roma, prisoners of war, anyone who did not fit an idea of pure. That is what comes of building a nation on hate." He let the silence stretch until even the cicadas seemed to hold their breath. "When you rebuild Germany, do not rebuild that," he said finally. "Do not rebuild a world where skin or religion or birthplace decides who is a person and who is not. You have seen with your own eyes that different races can serve together, work together, make music together. We are far from perfect in this country, Lord knows that, but we are trying to do better. You have a chance to do better too." Later, some women would say this was the first time they had heard an officer speak so plainly about their own guilt. That evening, as the heat bled slowly out of the ground and fireflies began their slow, pulsing dance, Greta went to find Sergeant Wilson under their usual pine. He sat with his back against the rough bark, cigarette ember glowing in the dusky light. The air smelled of warm resin and tobacco. "I need to tell you something," she began in careful English, heart hammering. He gestured to the stump opposite. "Go on." "I always said we didn't know," she said. "About the camps, about the Jews, it was half true. I did not know everything. But I knew trains left and did not return. I heard words like evacuation and special treatment, and I did not ask. I told myself it was not my concern." Her voice tightened. "And I believed what they told me about you. that black people were dangerous, stupid. It was easy to believe because it made me feel high. She groped for the word. Superior. Now I see it was a lie I liked. Wilson watched the smoke curl from his cigarette, then crushed it out under his heel. I can't change what I thought, she said, words rushing now. I can only say I am ashamed, more than I can say in your language. He was quiet for a long moment. A mosquito droned near his ear. He flicked it away. Folks always want to jump to forgiveness, he said at last, choosing each phrase with care for the interpreter, hovering a few steps away. But I can't speak for the ones who died in those camps, or for my own people treated like dirt here. I don't own their pain, so I don't own their pardon. Her shoulders sagged. Then what can I do? You live like you mean what you just said, he replied. Next time somebody talks about the good old days back home, about strong men and pure blood, you don't stay quiet. You teach your kids different. Your students, if you have any, you act like the kind of person who would have hidden her Jewish neighbor instead of closing the curtains. She swallowed. You believe we can change? He looked at her for a long heartbeat, then nodded once. I have to, he said. Otherwise, why didn't I just let you sleep in the rain? The exchange etched itself into her memory more deeply than any sermon. It framed the choice Hayes had set before them in the yard, to carry home either the old myths, polished and defiant, or the raw, uncomfortable lessons of bacon shared, storms weathered, and jazz heard across a barbed wire divide. A few weeks later, when the first repatriation lists went up and the reality of departure became dates and transport numbers, that choice would stop being theoretical. It would board the ships with them, slip into ruined streets beside them, and determine what kind of country rose from the rubble. Repatriation began on mornings that felt more like winter than peace. October 1945. A thin mist clung to the pine trunks as trucks rolled into the Louisiana camp, engines coughing in the chill. The air smelled of damp earth and diesel with a faint undercurrent of bacon from an early mess. Lists had gone up days before, names, numbers, departure dates. Now small groups of women stood with their few belongings, some clothes, photographs, bundles of letters and diaries swollen from the humidity. At the gate, Captain Hayes waited in his pressed uniform, gloves on despite the warmth rising with the sun. One by one, as each truck filled, he raised his hand in a formal salute. It was not required by any regulation to salute defeated enemies, but he did it anyway. Danke, murmured more than one woman, climbing onto the tailgate. In the yard, quiet farewells unfolded. Lisa Miller approached Private Marcus Brown, the baseball coach of those soft evenings. Thank you for kindness, she managed in slow English. He grinned, teeth white against his dark skin. You remember the rules? He said, miming a swing. Ball comes your way, you don't run from it. You hit. She laughed, tears on her cheeks, the smell of tobacco and pine resin fixing the moment in her senses. Under their usual tree, Greta found Sergeant Wilson one last time. The bark under her palm felt rough. The air buzzed with insects and an odd sense of unreality. I will remember this place, she said. And you. Remember what you learned, he corrected gently. I was just here. Will you remember me? She asked. He considered. I'll remember that people can change, he said, even when everything in their world told them not to. Don't make a liar out of me. They shook hands, her narrow fingers swallowed by his broad, calloused grip, a gesture that would have been unthinkable in Hamburg a year earlier. The trucks carried roughly 80 women at a time back to New Orleans. From there, troop ships waited, grey hulls against grey water. On one such vessel, over 600 POWs were crammed into the holds, women from Louisiana, men from other camps in Texas, Oklahoma, the Midwest. At night, in the stagnant air smelling of sweat and bilge, stories traded like contraband. In our camp, the guards beat a man for stealing bread, one soldier boasted bitterly. Americans are all the same. The women from Louisiana shook their heads. They spoke of roll calls at dawn mist, of 3,000-calorie rations when their families survived on half that, of black sergeants who stopped convoys to give fainting prisoners water. Some men scoffed, calling them brainwashed. Others listened in silence, the seeds of doubt taking root in soil already loosened by defeat. When the ship docked at Cherbourg, the same port where their journey had begun, the air was colder, carrying the sting of coal smoke. The cranes still stood, but the town beyond bore fresh scars. From there, trains fanned out across a country in ruins. By war's end, Allied bombing had destroyed or damaged up to 70% of housing stock in cities like Dresden and Cologne. Now, from the slatted car windows, the women saw block after block of rubble, walls standing like broken teeth, streets choked with bricks and twisted metal. I stepped onto the platform and the wind smelled of dust and burned things, Greta wrote. I thought of the pine trees and wet heat, of coffee and jazz and a black man who talked of breaking chains. It felt like another planet. In Hamburg, Greta eventually secured a room in a half-collapsed building and a post at a rebuilt school. When she stood before her first class of thin-faced teenagers, chalk dust on her fingers, she did not recite the sanitized timeline some colleagues preferred. She spoke instead of trains that left at night, of laws that made neighbors disappear, of 6 million murdered for being born into the wrong family. And one day, when the topic of America arose, she told them about Louisiana, about a camp where German prisoners ate eggs and bacon while their families boiled dandelions, about blackguards who could not vote at home but treated their captives with more humanity than their captives' regime had shown its own. This was not propaganda, she told them. This was reality. I saw it. I was it. Some parents complained. A few called her Verräterin, traitor, but others listened. Over the years, dozens of students would say her stories were the first time they truly understood what never again required. Lisa never returned to Munich. During the Allied occupation, she met an American GI, married him, and by the early 1950s found herself in Georgia, 3 streets away from the Wilson family. The summers were as humid as Louisiana. The cicadas screamed just as loudly. Their children played stickball in the road together, dark and light hands passing balls and toys with the thoughtlessness of those who have not been taught to hate. When old friends from Germany wrote and asked, "How can you live among Negroes?" Lisa later recounted, "I wrote back, because they are just people, because everything we were told was a lie." Captain Hayes stayed in uniform through Korea and beyond, retiring as a colonel with a chestful of ribbons. In a box in his attic, he kept a bundle of letters, thin airmail sheets from Germany, written in careful English by former prisoners. One became a nurse again, one a farmer's wife, one signed simply, "Your former PW, who now teaches her children. There is no master race." Sergeant James Wilson used his GI Bill to finish school. He became a teacher, then a principal in a small southern town, his classroom smelling of chalk, floor polish, and sometimes on special days, the sweet smoke of barbecue wafting in from a nearby field. In the 1960s, when sit-ins and marches shook the country, he was there, coat off, tie loosened, explaining to nervous parents why change was coming, whether they liked it or not. When asked, late in life, what gave him the stubborn belief that hardened hearts could soften, he would sometimes smile and tell a story about German women in a Louisiana camp who arrived afraid of black monsters and left grateful to black men who had protected them. Historians, combing through records decades later, noted these small threads. Between 1942 and 1946, hundreds of thousands of German POWs had passed through American hands. Tens of thousands had been guarded by African American troops, especially in the segregated South, where white commanders relegated black units to lesser duties like supply and prisoner control. Yet in those marginal spaces, something quietly subversive happened, living daily counter-evidence to the Nazi racial gospel. The Louisiana camp where Greta spent 9 months is gone now. The barracks were torn down, the wire rolled away, the land went back to farming. In some places, a modest plaque notes, that Axis prisoners of war were held here, 1944 to 1946. The wind moves through the grass, the sun bakes the soil. You would never guess that on this anonymous patch of ground, women who once believed themselves chosen by history learned, under the gaze of men their laws had called inferior, to start doubting themselves instead. They had come as conquerors, helpers, certain of their place atop a racial hierarchy. They left as students, carrying notebooks full of memories that contradicted everything that hierarchy claimed. Word count 155, including earlier overrun Section 8 alone, WWII 620. In the end, that is the legacy that matters most, not the schedules of transports or the tables of rations, but the human equations quietly rewritten. A nurse in Hamburg who teaches her pupils that dignity is indivisible. A woman in Georgia whose children grow up thinking it normal that their black uncle once guarded their mother. A retired colonel and an old principal who keep letters in boxes because they prove that mercy is not wasted. Nazism was bombed into ruins by armies and industry, but in hearts like Greta's, it was dismantled by something smaller and slower. Cups of coffee poured without malice, blankets handed out in a storm, music shared across a fence. This wasn't propaganda, it was reality, chosen daily. In the long tally of war, tanks and planes decide who wins territory. But in the long memory of humanity, the true victories belong to those who refuse to become what they fight. In the end, the most powerful weapon against tyranny was not fire or steel, but the simple decision to treat even an enemy as human and to let that fact speak for itself across generations.